Hey guys, in this video I'm going to go over our current video settings. Although we use Sony cameras here at Lister Pros, most of these settings will work for most mirrorless and DSLR cameras. You should be able to find similar settings regardless of the camera you are shooting with. Now, if you're versed in videography and know the ins and outs of camera settings and want to spend more time fine-tuning each shot, feel free to shoot in manual mode and manually adjust all your camera settings for each shot. That being said, this settings video is designed for that beginner that wants to produce high quality results without worrying too much about camera settings, or that person that wants a simplified shooting style in order to train others. Our goal has always been to set our camera settings as simple as possible for our media specialists so that they can get up and running and start shooting video as soon as possible. We set our camera settings up so that even a person with no video experience can start shooting video in a relatively short amount of time and only have to manage two variables at the property. And those two variables are composition and exposure. We want them to focus on capturing great shots of the home and ensuring that the shot isn't too bright or too dark. I want to mention that we don't follow conventional wisdom regarding some of our camera settings, so don't be alarmed when our shutter speed is not double the frame rate or I choose to set my aperture to f4. Now, there are slight differences in the camera settings between my personal preferences and the settings that we teach our media specialists, so I'll be sure to cover those differences as well. Here are our current media specialist settings. Exposure mode set to shutter priority. File format is XAVC SHD. Record setting to 60p at 50 megabits per second. Aperture is set automatically. Shutter speed is set at 1/60. Auto ISO is set between 100 and 12,800. White balance is set to automatic. Picture profile is set to 10. The S&Q settings are 24p and the frame rate at 120 frames per second. Exposure wheel defaults are +1 for exteriors and +2 for interiors. Focus mode is autofocus continuous. The focus area is set to wide. Autofocus transition speed is set to 4. Subject shift sensitivity is set to 2. Distortion compensation is set to auto. So those are the settings for our media specialist. Now here are my personal preferences. Exposure mode set to aperture priority. File format is XAVC HS4K. Record setting to 60p, 200 megabits per second, 422 10-bit color. Aperture is set between f4 and f13. Default aperture for exteriors is f8, and the default aperture for interiors is f4. Shutter speed is set automatically, and the auto ISO settings is between 100 and 12,800. White balance is set to automatic. Picture profile is set to 10. S&Q settings are set to 24p and the frame rate is at 120 frames per second. Exposure wheel defaults +0.7 for exteriors and +1.7 for interiors. Focus mode is set to autofocus continuous. Focus area is set to wide. Autofocus transition speed is set to 4. Subject shift sensitivity is set to 2. And distortion compensation is set to auto. So ISO, white balance, picture profile, focus settings, and S&Q settings are identical. Regardless of what set of settings you use, the end result is going to be very similar. Shooting with exposure mode shutter priority allows you to set the shutter speed and let the camera adjust aperture and ISO automatically. Exposure mode is one setting that I would recommend experimenting with to figure out which camera variables you would like to manage, if any. That being said, there are times when we're shooting high-end custom homes, and for those I shoot in full manual and spend time adjusting every shot. But for 99% of the videos that we do, I shoot in aperture priority. Now let's talk about aperture settings. With our media specialist exposure mode set to shutter priority, the aperture is set automatically for them. For me, since I set my aperture manually, I'll go over the settings that I use. By default, for exterior shots, my aperture is typically set around f8, and for interior shots, my aperture is set around f4. That being said, there are times when I do set my aperture higher than f8 and lower than f4 should I have the need to do so for a specific shot. Now let's talk about file format. The file format our media specialists use is XAVC-S HD because the finished product we deliver to our customers is usually 1080p. This file type also helps to keep the video file sizes manageable and is less taxing on our editors' computers. I prefer to shoot in 4K, so I use XAVC-HS 4K most of the time because I like the quality improvement as well as the ability to scale in footage without losing quality should I have the need to do so. Now let's talk about shutter speed. Conventional wisdom says to set your shutter speed to double your frame rate, but we haven't seen much of a negative impact in setting the shutter speed at the frame rate. Having a shutter speed set to 60 versus 120 allows us to have a cleaner image as our camera is essentially allowing twice the amount of light hit the sensor for each frame. This allows the camera to operate at a lower ISO setting and produce a less noisy image in low light conditions. Now you can change your recording frame rate from 60 to 30 or even 24 frames per second, but we found that our media specialists, especially newer ones, tend to move a little bit too fast in properties, so shooting at 60 frames per second allows us to slow the footage down should we have the need to do so during the editing process. I personally shoot at 24 frames per second most of the time and pay close attention to my movement speed. Now let's talk about ISO. We've set our ISO settings to automatic with the lower limit set to 100 and the upper limit set to 12,800. We found that this is a good range for clean usable footage with the Sony cameras that we use. Now depending on the camera that you're using, you may not be able to push your ISO setting that high, so if you're not using a newer Sony camera, be sure to test your video ISO settings before setting your upper limit. When you're testing your upper limit of your camera's ISO settings, what you're looking for is at what point does grain or noise get introduced into your footage, and when you do hit that point, you want to make sure that your ISO setting is a little bit lower. Now let's talk about white balance. We set our white balance to auto. We found that Sony cameras do a pretty good job automatically setting the white balance. There may be times when you experience conflicting lighting conditions in a particular room. If this is the case, you may need to set your white balance manually. Major white balance issues are more prevalent during twilight, but this shouldn't be an issue very often. If you're using a Sony camera, one thing to note is that as you transition from one room to another, it can take the camera a second to adjust the white balance setting. So before hitting record, give your camera a second to properly set the white balance. It's important to have an accurate white balance when shooting video because it can be very time consuming to adjust it during the editing process. Now let's talk about picture profiles. We like to use picture profile 10. PP10, which is a hybrid log gamma profile, does a great job with dynamic range and produces a high quality image in camera. We like using this picture profile because we don't have to make many color adjustments during the editing process. If you want to fine-tune your footage's look, you can select a different picture profile and even adjust the sub settings within that picture profile. This might be one of those camera settings that you want to play around with. That being said, we use picture profile 10 with its standard settings, and we found that it produces an excellent result for us in most shooting scenarios. Now let's talk about our S&Q settings. S&Q stands for slow and quick motion. We use this setting for slow motion shots. Our record setting is set to 24p since that is our final project frame rate, and our frame rate for S&Q is set to 120 frames per second. This setting gives us a 5x slow motion video. We like to use slow motion to spice up our videos and capture slow motion shots of water features, light fixtures, landscaping, and other interesting features of the home. We like to use this feature after we shoot our standard walkthrough video footage to capture shots that will make the video more interesting. Now let's talk about focus settings. We set our focus mode to autofocus continuous with the focus area set to wide. We leave the autofocus transition speed to the camera's default of 4 and the subject shift sensitivity to 2, which is also the camera default. We have found that these autofocus settings make for smooth transitions for our real estate videos, although using autofocus isn't perfect. Also, one setting that's not turned on by default in Sony cameras is lens distortion compensation. You want to make sure that this setting is set to auto. What this does is remove lens distortion from your footage as long as the camera can recognize the lens you're using. Outside of focusing on good composition and moving slowly, we train our media specialists to use the Sony camera's exposure wheel to make the shot brighter or darker depending on the lighting scenario. Our default exposure wheel setting for exterior shots is +1 and +2 for interiors. These are our default settings, and depending on the weather and the individual property, these settings will change, but this is a good place to start. I'll also mention that my personal preference is +0.7 for exteriors and +1.7 for interiors. We train at +1 and +2 because it's easier to remember. Alright guys, so these are the video settings that we currently use here at Lister Pros, as well as my personal preferences. Like I said at the beginning, feel free to adjust the settings as you see fit. There's no perfect solution for camera settings, so feel free to test out different settings. These particular settings have worked well for us, and they are a good place to start, especially for somebody that's just starting or looking to train others. At the end of the day, the important thing isn't necessarily your camera settings, but that you deliver a consistent video product to your customers. Even though I shoot slightly different than our media specialist, the end result is essentially the same, and that's what matters most. Alright guys, that's gonna do it for the video settings video. Reach out if you have any questions. We'll see you guys on the next one.